Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. We are going to get started in just about 1 minute. Okay, it looks like we are at 2 o'clock Eastern. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to everyone who's joined us today for one of our conversations with a wise and excellent McKinney-Vento liaison that I am happy to know for quite some years now. I can't even remember how long, but it's been a little while. So Crystal, welcome. I'm going to just get us started by asking you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your school district and what you do.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I'm Crystal Haslett. I am coordinator of student programs and community liaison for Washington Township schools. I am a school social worker before transitioning into this more administrative role right now. I was the school social worker at our local high school for about 4 years, and then prior to that worked in the role of school social worker in all of our buildings, basically. I've been the McKinney-Vento homeless education liaison for, I think, since about 2002. And so for many, many years, and am also the district foster care point of contact. So my school district, Washington Township Schools, is located in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the north side of Indy. We have about 11,000 students in our district, almost 4,000 students at our one high school. We have 3 middle schools, 8 elementary schools, a preschool program that services students who are receiving special education services, and a career center. So just a little bit about my school district and me.
That's great. Thanks, Crystal. And of course, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Patricia Senior Strategist for Program Advancement and Legal Affairs at Schoolhouse Connection. So for those of you who may not have participated in this particular webinar series before, there is no PowerPoint presentation, no handouts. Crystal and I are just going to have a conversation. And we also welcome you to ask any questions that you might have. You can type your questions into the questions pane at any time. And in about 15 minutes or so, we're going to dive right into your questions. We also welcome you to type in your answers to the questions that I'm going to ask Crystal. I know that many, many people on this call are doing creative and innovative and effective strategies to deal with the pandemic that we're all confronted with right now. And we'd love to be able to share out your best practices as well. So please feel free to type in your questions, but also your tips and your strategies. So I'm going to dive in, Crystal, with my first question for you. This is a concern I'm hearing from all over the country about students who really since last March, over a year now, have just kind of fallen off the radar. Students have not connected to distance learning. They're not coming into your in-person classes. You just kind of lost them. So how are you reaching out to families and students to try to make sure that you're able to identify your McKinney-Vento students and connect them to school?
Yeah, I would say that for sure it's been like an all hands on deck kind of approach since last March. And I know that's not going to sound surprising to anybody listening to this right now. I feel like we are and have been collaborating at a rate much higher, a level much higher than we really ever have in the past. Like I feel like we thought we were collaborating before the pandemic, like with people, like personnel within our schools and with community partners. And I think for the most part, we were all doing a pretty good job with that. But I feel like the pandemic most certainly brought that to a whole nother level. And so I would say the school social workers, school administrators, teachers, district translators, our partner agencies have really all stepped up to do personal outreach to students who are learning virtual and have had challenges connecting. So we've used obviously technology at a very high rate to connect with students and families. So apps like Remind, which allows us to send out like text messages in a safe way to students. The Canvas platform, online learning platform that we use, we're able to message students that way as well. We at our high school particularly started doing monthly webinars for our students and families that then would be pushed out to them also electronically, but would provide updated information about kind of the schedule for their school building at the time. And it was in a way where then parents could watch the webinar whenever they had time to do it, or students could, watch it and rewatch it, as opposed to having kind of a one-off communication, if you will. I would say our home visits increased significantly, particularly for our families that are transient or doubled up, tripled up, those in hotels. And we really relied on our community partners, honestly, to kind of help us and divide and conquer, if you will, in terms of those home visits. So there were lots of home visits that took place, particularly on doorsteps, to help students navigate the online platform that we were using to figure out what the schedule was at that time. Is the name of the game with the pandemic was like things were changing all the time. Right. So there were a lot of visits that took place on doorsteps to kind of go with laptops in hand to kind of go through what does the schedule look like? How do you access your classes? How do you figure out what the schedule is? How do you communicate with your teachers? So long kind of winded answer to say that all hands on deck, everybody was engaged in terms of the school personnel, school counselors, support staff, really nothing unturned, everybody kind of all hands on deck for sure.
That's great. That's really interesting what you said about doing those sort of doorstep visits with laptop in hand, because I think a lot of times, at least I feel like young people know everything about technology. They know how to connect everything. They know how to navigate everything. But I think what we found is that that's actually not true in some of these online platforms and connecting to them and turning in your work. And so sometimes just going there with the computer and really walking through it the way, I might think, well, I do that with my mom, but I don't need to do that with a 15-year-old. But, well, yeah, sometimes you do have to do that with a younger person too.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree.
That's great. So let me ask you, for some of those students who may have become disengaged and you might be trying to get them back into school. Now, I know you said that your school buildings are open. A lot of students are coming back to in-person learning, so you want to get your students engaged. What are you doing to kind of draw them back into school and to keep them in school, get them credit for this school year and hopefully, obviously have them come back in the fall? How are you doing that engagement work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think, again, like, kind of pre-pandemic, right, challenges with engagement has always been something that as educators, we've had to pay attention to. So who's not coming to school, who's not attending school, who's not showing up regularly, where are the challenges that with our students with engagement, right? That's something that I think we've always paid attention to and had to have some kind of response for, if you will. But I would say that, at least for my school district, prior to the pandemic, there was that initial reach out to the young person who may not be attending school regularly or consistently. And then maybe there was a follow-up, but that may have really been dependent upon if a new issue did come up for that young person or they just weren't showing up at school at all. I would say fast forward to the pandemic, and now when we look at our students that are having challenges engaging, now we are reaching out initially, like I said, with everyone on deck in terms of as many people as we can, reaching out to students, but then we are intentional about the next follow-up. So weekly, monthly, like those are scheduled in terms of who's going to contact that student or that parent and what is the best way that we learned to contact them. So what works for them? Is it having a Zoom session? Is it going out to the doorstep? Is it the Google Voice text number that was set up like by the counselor for themselves to be able to safely text the student? So now those are intentional follow-ups on a regular basis that are scheduled, as opposed to kind of waiting to see, did that work that first time that we reached out? Are they still not showing up? Did something else present itself? Now it's an actual check-in to say, we're so glad that you were able to show up these past 5 days, and you said you were going to do it and you didn't, and you did it, or we missed you, like we thought you were we had this plan in place and we didn't see you at third or fourth period, whatever. So intentionality, like actually having a schedule of who's going to do what, is what we really have been doing during the pandemic to really kind of address that like lack of engagement.
That's fantastic. And that's, that's really all about relationships. I think, the relationships that you're building with your colleagues to bring them into that work with you. And then also that you're all building with the students and families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said, I try to catch myself because I'm trying to get rid of that phrase lack of engagement, because it doesn't feel as asset-based as I would like to be. So not so much that the student is lacking engagement, but that there's challenges associated with their engagement. And what are we doing to kind of improve that, or just ensure that they actually are able to engage with instruction. So been trying to catch myself on that.
That's great. That's great. Now, let me ask you a little bit maybe of a technical question about attendance. And I know this is changing now as students are coming back to in-person learning, but I think it's been really challenging to calculate attendance for virtual learning, because particularly for our McKinney-Vento students, they can't always get online for the synchronous classes, whether it's a technological problem or whether it's just a problem of their environment. And so, I know some school districts have been offering asynchronous options or different ways to calculate attendance, trying to get students credit for the work they're trying to do, even if they can't always quite get there. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you all have been handling attendance? Have you been able to provide flexibility for students, and how have you done that?
Yeah, I think that's flexibility is the name of the game in terms of this period of time that we're in right now. So yes, there's a couple of things that I feel like our teachers and attendance personnel have been able to do in terms of flexibility. I think it's important to point out that, our teachers have had to, this virtual code versus in-person code versus out because of COVID, right? These are like new attendance codes that our teachers and people in our buildings that are responsible for attendance have had to learn very quickly. And in order to be compliant with what our states are giving us in terms of the guidelines for attendance. And so I can't really shout out teachers and attendance personnel enough all over the country for just adjusting to that and getting that figured out. Because it's not just the school building, right? It's the guidelines that the states are giving us in terms of what those attendance codes need to be, and people, school districts have a responsibility to be compliant in terms of that. And so just a shout out to teachers and attendance personnel who have learned that on the fly and have been super consistent with it. I feel like we've done a really good job, honestly, of utilizing, again, like our school social workers and our school counselors to really assist and communicate clearly with our teachers and with attendance personnel in terms of what it means to be flexible for some of our students that might be in different life situations or housing situations that would present a barrier to them having their camera on. Well, I'll just starting showing up for the class in the first place, like logging on and connecting. But if they're able to get through that, having their camera on, or not being muted the entire time for the class, right? There's challenges that our students and families are experiencing that might then, present that kind of a situation, basically. And so we've tried to be very transparent and clear with our teachers and attendance personnel, and not necessarily pointing out a particular child or family situation, but saying, consider the fact that, some of our families are in housing situations where they can't control their environment. So they could be sharing housing of another family member or friend. It's a really difficult situation because that's a lot of people sometimes in one space. The health crisis is obviously happening, and so people are fearful about that and trying to do their best with social distancing, but sometimes their living situation doesn't allow for that. And so because a young person can't always control the environment around them, that might be a reason why they don't have their camera on, or they don't have the volume, or they're muted the entire time. Being in a homeless shelter, being in a foster home where they're new to the space, and so they're just trying to kind of get that figured out, and also don't have a lot of control over their environment. And so a couple of the things that our teachers is happening in the buildings We've used Google Forms to some degree to, like a teacher might create a Google form for the each student to complete for attendance and count that for attendance and participation. And so that way, if you filled out the Google form, right, and for that class, and just because you didn't show up for on camera or you were muted the whole time, you still get credit, right, for that class and for your participation in the class if you completed that Google form. So that's one of, I think, a real creative thing that a lot of our middle and high school teachers have been able to do. Additionally, we use Canvas, like I mentioned before, as an online platform. So lots of different ways to kind of put discussion boards up, or have a young person, have students in the class answer a question for participation and for attendance. And so we really tried to utilize some of those different strategies for counting attendance. And then, I know a lot of the things that I've talked about and listed obviously are reliant on technology. And so, that's been really tough. But, a lot of our teachers too have, said, if you can call in to their homework hotline or to their voicemail and leave a message, if you can. So just like ways that we're trying to get creative in terms of just making that contact with students, and so that we can count, the teachers are able to count that for participation or for attendance. It doesn't always work, but it's one of those things that we've tried to do to, especially when we're made aware that the situation is what it is. And we're really careful too with that information. Like, we're very clear with our teachers that you may not get to know, right, all of the details that are going on, but do know that the parent or the child has communicated with the school social worker, with the school counselor, with the McKinney-Vento liaison. And so we're telling you, we need to get creative in terms of ways that we can connect, so that we're not counting a child as absent when they actually are showing up the way that they can show up.
Oh my gosh, there were so many gems in what you just said. There's so many things that I loved. I mean, I loved at the very beginning when you talked about just talk a little bit about what flexibility means. Because a lot of times we think we're being flexible, but we're really not, because we're not fully appreciating the challenges that are actually happening on the other end of our conversation or our teaching. And the way you're managing privacy too. You said a couple of times you don't always get to know all the details. You might not even know that a particular student is a McKinney-Vento student, but you have to assume that in your classroom there are, at least one, maybe more than one. And so really try to extend that grace to everyone, particularly this year when we know that we're really under identifying McKinney-Vento students because of the distance, because of virtual. You can't assume that everyone who's experiencing homelessness in any classroom. So we really do have to extend that grace to all the students. You're getting all kinds of comments in the chat box about that. Thank you for that. I want to ask you my last couple of questions really quickly, because lots of people have questions in the chat. But one question actually was, dovetails with one of mine. You said a couple of times that it's been all hands on deck this year, even more than usual. And so I wonder if you could talk specifically about some of the key partners in the school district. You've already talked a little bit, but more than that, in the community that are helping you with this outreach, engagement, and connection.
Yeah, I love this question, because I love our community partners, and I every chance I get am shouting out our partners, and realize that there's just no way that we can service the whole child and the whole family without our community partners. So we have really two very strong organizations, agencies in Indianapolis that provide services to youth and young adults and families experiencing homelessness. Outreach Inc. is one of those agencies that works particularly with teenagers and young people and young adults who experience homelessness. They have been instrumental. So in March, when the pandemic hit, they had already built relationships with many of our high school students that were unaccompanied homeless youth. And they were the ones who really kind of beat us to the locations where they knew our young people were, whether they were staying with a friend temporarily or wherever they had found to stay, or if they were staying at a transitional housing placement. They they kind of beat us to that, and were giving us the information as to, hey, I made contact with this kiddo. They need a hotspot, or they need to have their laptop looked at because it's not connecting, or they were just identifying kind of what those needs were, letting us know as the school social workers at the high school. And then we were making that connection and, meeting that need along with outreach for those young people. And then what was so great about also having a relationship already established with outreach was, you said it really well, it was just scary. It was scary not to have young people in the building and have eyes on them, knowing the difficult situations that they were facing in terms of their housing situations. And so, the pandemic did not stop young people from experiencing homelessness and transiency. And so we had a couple of times at our high school where we had technology pickups, or obviously we had once a week food distribution where families could come and pick up food. And I remember several times a couple of our high school students walking up, taking the bus and then walking up and saying I don't know where I'm going to go tonight. And so because we had that relationship with outreach already established, we were able to just make that connection right away for that young person with outreach, and then know that they were going to follow up with that young person that day, and just kind of start assessing and kind of figuring out and problem solving with the young person where they could possibly go. And there were so many barriers in place, I think, for schools at that time. With our school district leadership, it was very important that we were in compliance with what our state and local government was saying we had to do in terms of stay-at-home orders and these kinds of things. And so it felt like as a school, we had some limits on what we could do, because we were being told by our leadership, it's important to comply with the state and local government guidance, I guess is what the right word is for that. But our partner agencies had more flexibility. And so because we had that relationship with them, many of their agencies were considered essential, essential workers, right, for lack of it. And so they were able to still be out and to still meet young people where they needed to meet them, obviously masked up and social distanced. But it gave us this outlet to be able to continue to reach our young people that were just going through such hard situations with their housing. So I feel like I talked forever about that. I'm so sorry, but outreach for sure. And then the other agency we have a really good relationship with and partnership with is called School on Wheels. And they provide academic support and mentoring, particularly to younger children and families experiencing homelessness. And so again, already had kind of established relationship with them and partnership with them. So they had families they were already working with and providing tutoring to children in our elementary and some of our middle schools. And same thing kind of with them, they were reaching out and they were doing a lot of those doorstep tutoring sessions or meeting at the park, or where they could social distance and be outside. And even when it got cold, they were able to just kind of pivot and accommodate the situation and continue. They did a lot of virtual tutoring as well, obviously, so it wasn't always face to face, but it kept those children and those families, I think, it just gave that extra level of support. And so then they became aware when hey, this family needs additional food. Can you, throw 3 more bags in that distribution when they come to school? Or they would come and actually pick up the food and take it to the family. So those 2 agencies. And then the last thing, we have a very strong partnership with faith-based organizations in our school district. So we happen to be in a geographic area where we don't have a lot of community centers or kind of that type of support in our area, but we do have a ton of faith-based organizations. And so they stepped up in a huge way and started coming to get food from our distribution sites and taking it out to our apartment complexes or bus stops, or some of our bus stops, so that parents could come and get the food from there if the school was not as close to them to be able to retrieve it. So okay. I think I said way too much. I don't remember, but our partnerships are there's just no way, we just can't do it without them. So
right. Absolutely, absolutely. All right, let me ask you my last question, then we'll
Sure.
get to some more questions in the questions box. But as you are looking towards the next school year, we're already after spring break now, so starting to look towards next year, what are you afraid of? What are your biggest worries, and what strategies are you putting in place to try to address those?
Yeah. One major thing that we continue to be really, I'd say, worried about are our multilingual families. And so we have
Mm,
we have a large population of families that are multilingual. And one of the things that really came up during this time period of having school not the buildings not be open is that we heard from many of our district translators that our families that are multilingual just really struggled with all of the changes. Things were changing so quickly and so frequently in terms of we made adjustments even with like things like food distribution plan, right? And we would push that out, as much as we could on social media and email parents and that kind of thing. But a lot of those things don't translate when the dialect is, not necessarily. Of course, we could send that information to Spanish-speaking families, but when you get to some of the other languages, it's difficult to just make sure that all of those kind of online platforms are translating appropriately where the parents are receiving the accurate information, right? We've made some adjustments to that. We've had our district translators do some videos, and so then we can push that out in all different dialects. We have on our website, there's an ability for a parent to push a button and get the information in their language. And so we're working on things like that. But I would say that's probably what I'm most concerned about, that we still just see that there's a disconnect with many of our multilingual families in terms of just what's kind of happening, what the schedule is, what do I know, what to expect? Is it safe for my child to be at school? Like just these kinds of things. And so I think that's something that we really have to continue to be intentional about. I also worry about, honestly, once the eviction moratorium kind of lifts in our county, once, a lot of that, the additional money that parents have been able to receive through food stamps with a lot and the stimulus and that kind of thing, when those kinds of financial benefits, if you will, kind of go away, I'm worried about what that means for our children and families in terms of housing, in terms of access to food. So that I think is something that we have to be mindful of. I don't know really what the answer necessarily is to that, but I think we just have to be cognizant and mindful that those things are going to happen, and the consequences of that could be pretty dire for many of our children and families.
absolutely. That's definitely something I'm afraid of. I think probably everybody on this call is. Well, let me jump into the chat box here and pull out a few questions for you. One is, you talked about the sort of doorstep visits and the home visits during COVID. Do you all have any kind of a written protocol or procedure that you used around, the social distancing, the masking, anything that you could share, or was it just more informal, make sure you wear a mask, make sure you keep distance?
I'd say it was informal, but I will say, and I can make a note of this and see if I can get this to you, Patricia, our health services team developed some protocols for us around any kind of like face-to-face contact with families when we were coming back to school in August, because there was concern from school social workers that they wanted to make sure that they were following rules that and in compliance, if you will. So our health services team did actually develop some for us. I mean, I would say it's really what you would expect, but it is in writing. I mean, it was, to wear a mask. It was they had recommended that we contact the parent ahead of time and ask those kind of COVID questions that you'll notice a lot of agencies or organizations asking now, right? So is anybody within the house tested positive within a certain amount of days? Is there anyone in the house experiencing a fever, cough, like these kinds of things we got directly from our health services team. But they were pretty consistent with what you would normally see in terms of that. But we do have it in writing, so I'd be happy to send that.
Yeah, that would be great. I have some follow-up material I have to send from last week's webinar, so I can kind of add this to it and send it out. That would be terrific. Let's see, we have some ideas around attendance, things like having principals do outreach, liaisons visits, direct contact with students rather than through parents sometimes, particularly for unaccompanied youth, of course. Provide incentives, tie in mentors and social services and resource networks. Use of truancy in child services is a last resort, of course. Totally agree with that. So thank you for sharing those tips. I like having other tips to share. Here's a question. Are you doing any paper packets for students who don't have technology access, or is it everything pretty much online for the virtual?
That's a great question. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Yes, we are doing paper packets in most of our, I would say all of our elementaries, and certainly some of the secondary schools have a system for that. Like there's, kind of a station set up right outside of the school front doors, or right inside of kind of the double doors. And if you walk into most of our school buildings still now for virtual students, because we have returned to students in person, but there's still that virtual option, obviously. And so you walk into really most of our buildings and there's kind of a station set up right there that is a virtual, pickup packets and a system for like picking it up and returning or whatever kind of needs to happen. So yes, there is definitely a system in our buildings for that.
That's great. That sounds good. So we're coming up on time here. So I'm going to do one last question and one shout out. Someone says, I have a Washington Township mom and a School on Wheels volunteer in my department who both say Crystal is amazing.
Oh,
so I wanted to make sure that you got to hear that, Crystal. And I'm going to just do one last question since we're coming up on time. What strategies do you suggest to start preparing for the summer? Are you able to connect your McKinney-Vento students to any summer learning programs that you all are going to have available, and how are you doing that?
Yeah, we got really, I would say we're just blessed and lucky and all of those positive things with, again, our faith-based organizations and the one community center that is the closest to our district. And so I would just highlight that those the community centers, sorry, that are in your areas. One of the things that we are able to do is the closest community center that's in our area is actually holding a summer learning lab is what they're calling it. And so we're partnering with them. It's no cost to our parents, but students can sign up and go there for particular hours in the day, and they're going to be doing some academic kind of support things, and as well as like really addressing also SEL, social emotional learning, and just like creating some spaces for children in the summer months to kind of just keep some of those things going academically. We also were able to create some of those summer learning labs in a few of our churches as well, so that we could kind of hit across our district, if you will. So that's something that is really, because it'll be kind of in different areas across our district, it's more accessible to many of our families. And some of those are even within walking distance, and certainly in higher kind of concentration areas of where we have families that are doubled up or tripled up. So that's a really cool thing. I'm really excited about that. Obviously, we've also just within the district created some opportunities for summer school that we hadn't done in the past. And I know is not different, is not unique to our school district. All across the country, school districts are looking at how to adjust what summer school, or adjust what summer school maybe looked like before to now, to really meet the need, and kind of just get kids like just kind of back in, not really back because they are back in school right now, but just, not have that big kind of gap, if you will, that we typically have in the summer, is what I'm trying to say. So.
Right. Crystal, this has been fantastic. You've shared so many really specific strategies that people can try to replicate in their own districts. I appreciate that so much. We have lots of questions that we didn't have time to get to, and I apologize for that, but I will follow up with some people and we'll get a hold of that protocol that you mentioned and get that out to people as a follow-up as well. So thank you to everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you, Crystal, for your time and your wisdom and for everything that you do for your students and families. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, bye everyone. Have a wonderful day.